Hey guys, tonight we begin the curious case of Napoleon's pet rabbits. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the light, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So Uvea, find yourself standing on the windswept edge of the Swahili coast, where coral rock gleams in pale hues beneath the morning haze. And the sea sighs like an old man rising from a wooden bench. Come to Kilwa Kizwani sometime. In the 14th century, the town is neither bustling nor idle. It moves at the pace of trade winds and market disputes. If you listen closely, you might hear the scratch of a reed pen on parchment, the faint shuffle of sandals across the coral stone corridors of the Sultan's court, and the occasional cough of a scribe adjusting his inkpot. The scent is sharp, with salt but tinged with ink and the faint aroma of fermented millet. Here begins our tale, not with kings or conquests, but with the person charged with the least glamorous, yet most essential role in Kilwa, the tax collector. His name was Mulamu Rashid bin Wafi. Not a famous name. You won't find him in textbooks, but in a small square room tucked behind the Sultan's main hall. Rashid sat every morning behind a stone desk, recording the most delicate rhythms of empire, the movement of goods, the shifting weight of coin, and the whispered in line between what was owed and what was forgotten. Kilwa was a coastal gem, a coral-built city, glittering in the Arabian traveler Ibn Battuta's writings. Rashid, however, never traveled. His entire world was 3 rooms: the court archive, his modest home near the town's outer wall, and the small mosque where he repeated the same whispered prayers each dusk, always sitting by the door. What made Rashid's life so peculiar and so quietly impactful was not merely his role, but the material he worked with. Coral stone ledgers. See, the humid climate and salty air often ruined paper. Parchment disintegrated faster than a merchant's. Promises during monsoon season. Rashid, fastidious and quietly inventive, proposed an odd solution to the Sultan's council, one that made the vizier scoff and the imam raise an eyebrow. He would carve the tax records into soft coral slabs. Coral stone, easy to etch when fresh from the reef, hardened in the dry heat of Kilwa summers. These slabs, once cured, could last decades, centuries even if kept shaded and away from the lashing rains. Rashid's idea was dismissed at first, but when 3 years of ledgers molded into mush in a leaky archive, the Sultan, with the sigh of someone admitting defeat to practicality, approved the plan. Rashid began carving. Not alone, he trained for young apprentices in the delicate art of coral scribing. These were not ornate inscriptions. They were dry, monotonous, and deeply precise. 2 sacks of millet, 1 spool of Persian cloth, taxed at 12%, delivered by Dal from Sofala, chiseled in blocky Swahili script mixed with Arabic digits. The records look like endless recipe lists, but each one mattered. You might think this was a fool's errand, that such records would be discarded, overwritten, or destroyed in some later conquest. Yet coral stone endures. Archaeologists in the 1980s found several slabs stacked like loaves behind a crumbling wall. The carvings were worn, yes, but legible. One of the slabs bore Rashid's name in a flourish, followed by a curious symbol, a fish with a quill in its mouth. What did it mean? Was it a signature? A family crest? A joke among scribes? No one knows. But it appears again, subtly scratched into 3 more slabs. Rashid, who lived a life of regulated monotony, seemed to enjoy leaving a small mystery behind. As the years passed, his apprentices spread the method to nearby towns Bagamoyo, Mikindani, and even as far as Mozambique Island. By 1370, at least 5 Swahili ports were recording their tariffs on coral slabs. Rashid, still unknown outside his coral-walled world, kept his records, his prayers, and his strange symbol. In his final years, his apprentices report that he grew quieter, as if his thoughts wandered elsewhere, to the sea that had never drawn him, or to the markets whose prices he tracked but never enjoyed. One day, Without ceremony, he simply stopped carving. His last slab, dated 1372, reads, 3 barrels of sesame oil from Lamu, taxed 9%. Paid in coin, excess withheld. Beneath it, the fish with the quill. No final message, no farewell. Just another entry? What happened next? Well, Kilwa's prosperity didn't last. Empires shifted. The Portuguese came. Then the Omanis. Rashid's choral records were buried, sealed behind crumbling courts and forgotten gardens. And yet if you stood there today, in that ruin of sun-bleached walls and open sky, might you still hear the faint sound of chiseling? Might you wonder why a man would choose permanence for something so small as a tax? Was Rashid trying to outlast time? Or was he simply stubbornly doing his job the best way he knew how? When Rashid ben Wafi stopped carving coral slabs in 1372, no one in Kilwa held a ceremony. There were no garlands, no gold coins, and no poetry read aloud in the Friday market. Tax collectors, after all, are rarely beloved. But something curious did happen. On the morning after Rashid's last ledger was filed into the court's archive chamber, his eldest apprentice, a wiry boy once nicknamed Thumbs for his inky fingers, arrived early to sweep the scriptorium floor. He found the tools arranged with Kara chisel laid parallel to a stone ruler, the coral slab balanced upright on a wooden stand, the small bowl of crushed charcoal dust sitting nearby. There was no note, only the final slab, cool to the touch, and a single pair of sandals left neatly by the door. Rashid, it seemed, had chosen to vanish like fog before the dawn. His apprentices, there were 4 of them by then, did not know what to do. They were not scholars or court officials. They were, at most, teenage scribes with blistered palms and uncertain handwriting. But they knew one thing: the work mattered. So, they continued. They called themselves the Inkless Guild, a title that sounds grander than it was. It was not an official designation, and they never filed a formal charter. But among themselves, it stuck. Each apprentice had learned from Rashid not just how to etch coral, but how to read between the numbers. Kilwa's economy was a breathing thing. You could see its pulses in the sudden spike of ambergris arriving from Lamu, or in the reduced tariffs on timber when the Sultan was planning to build new minarets. Thumbs, whose real name was Yusuf bin Kolfin, took over the day-to-day ledgers. He had Rashid's neatness, if not his patience. Fatima, the second apprentice, and the most quiet, started experimenting with shaded carving, using deep cuts to signal tariffs, paid in coin, and lighter ones for barter. She invented what might have been the world's earliest attempt at visual accounting. But it was Bashir, the third apprentice, who introduced the biggest change. One afternoon, sitting in the shade of the old tamarind tree behind the archive, he observed that Rashid's fish and quill signatures seemed to appear in different spots, sometimes above the record, sometimes below, sometimes beside a notation of excess withheld. "It's not a symbol," Bashir whispered. "It's a code." They tested the theory: a fish to the left, overpayment; a fish below, in-kind contribution; a fish followed by a quill, exemption for religious reasons. It wasn't always consistent, but the idea opened a door. Symbols could carry meaning beyond numbers, beyond language. And in a port where traders spoke a tangle of Swahili, Arabic, Persian, and Gujarati, this was revolutionary. Thus began what they later called the Silent Ledger movement. Ledgers were no longer just etched lists of taxes. They became entire visual maps of trade: fish, birds, coiled ropes, miniature boats, and even shells etched beside tariffs to indicate trade context. Soon, visiting traders could glance at a coral slab and without knowing a word of Swahili recognize their owed tax, the goods registered, and whether there was an outstanding fine. Word of the Inkless Guild spread quietly. Coral slabs began arriving in cloth bundles from other towns. Tungar, Mafia Island, and even as far as Lamu, scribes asked for training. Sometimes they just wanted to see how Bashir carved a coiled dowse. Sail in a single stroke? It was boring work. Incredibly boring. Each slab took hours of labor, required precision under poor lighting, and caused aching fingers that stiffened with sea salt. But it changed something. Historians often miss the slow revolutions. They chase after battles and treaties, conquests and dynasties. But what Rashid started, what his apprentices nurtured, was a revolution of process. A change in how people understood their civic role and how information could be preserved. There were unintended consequences too. Court officials began relying on these slabs for audits. For the first time, inconsistencies were noticed. A wealthy trader, claiming to pay 1 tariff in coin, was discovered to have bartered instead. A court magistrate found that a storehouse tax hadn't been updated in 6 years. Suddenly, accuracy mattered. This led to a flurry of court cases. The Sultan's court had to create a new position, Mtalamuwa, Mandishi Yama, stone writing expert. Guess who was appointed first? Not Yusuf, not Bashir, Fatima, the quietest of them all. She was summoned one morning to the main court. Sultan's vizier, robed in stiff silk and flanked by 2 peacocks on golden chains, asked her to explain a discrepancy in a 1369 record. Of Indian cotton, Fatima did not flinch. She pointed out the chisel markings and explained how Rashid had adopted a lighter stroke for barter records. She spoke precisely, without drama. When she finished, the vizier blinked, then nodded. Her, he said, and they did. She became the first woman in Kilwa's recorded history to hold a court position of fiscal authority. Over the next decade, Fatima trained new apprenticized boys and girls alike. The art of stone accounting spread. Inland, through caravans and word of, it reached towns that had never seen the sea. Each new scribe added their own symbols, their own flourishes, and their own quiet opinions carved into stone. But something strange happened in the 1390s. The symbols began changing. A new apprentice in Bagamoyo started using birds instead of fish. In Mikandani, the spiral shell became the dominant indicator of barter. And someone no one knows who started carving blank slabs with only symbols, no numbers at all. These were nearly impossible to decipher. But the idea had spread. History, trade, and civic record-keeping had become not just an act of documentation, but an art. The irony? The Portuguese, when they arrived a century later, found the slabs baffling. They called them fishermen's superstitions, and many were tossed into the sea or ground into ballast for their ships. But not all. In a dusty storeroom beneath the great mosque of Kilwa, archaeologists in the 1980s uncovered 17 slabs. One bore a bird with a fish in its mouth. Another showed a dhow sailing toward a half-moon, and etched faintly, just barely visible at the bottom of one slab. Do not trust the waves, but trust the ledger. Signed a fish with a quill. Was this Rashid's final teaching, or a tribute by one of his apprentices, long after he was gone? Time does what it always does. It wears down stone, scatters memory like dry leaves, and turns the once essential into the easily forgotten. By the early 1500s, the coral stone ledgers of Kilwa had fallen into disuse. The Portuguese, wielding gunpowder and demands written in thick Latin script, introduced new systems of accounting, ink-based, sealed with wax, and unreadable to most of Kilwa's scribes. The court changed hands. The Sultan was removed. Once proud scribes, trained in the gentle art of etching coral, were dismissed or repurposed as interpreters or low-level clerks. The stone slabs were deemed primitive, inefficient, and irrelevant. But some were hidden. Some of Rashid's original apprentices, older now, weathered like the slabs themselves, understood the significance of their records. Even if no one else did, they feared destruction, so they gathered what they could. With the help of sympathetic mosque caretakers and old merchants who remembered the days of fair taxation, they wrapped the slabs in goat-hide cloth, sealed them in pomegranate chests, and buried them beneath the tiled floor of Kilwa's eastern prayer house. They left no maps, no clear signs. Just one small inscription scratched into the corner of a wall niche. The books are asleep here. Do not wake them until the rains return. What did that mean? What rains? Which books? By the mid-16th century, no one remembered. The stone scribes were gone. Coral slabs became construction material. Some were reused in stairwells, others in garden walls. Rashid's fish and quill symbols slowly disappeared, absorbed into folk tales or reduced to scratches misinterpreted as decorative flourishes, and yet the rhythms of Rashid's work never truly vanished. In small ways, his legacy lingered like dust in a sealed archive. Take, for instance, a 17th-century Swahili poem found on Pemba Island, which describes a clerk who carved numbers into salt stone with the patience of the moon, or a 19th-century accounting method from Zanzibar that used etched wood tokens to track trade echoes of the coral slab era. Even in the 1930s, an ethnography recorded a tale told by elders in Kilwa of a man who spoke to stone and made it remember what the sea forgot. He was described as quiet, clean-shaven, and always counting things in his head. His name was not given, but the story ended with a fish leaping into the air, a quill in its mouth, and vanishing into the ocean. Missed. It wasn't until the late 20th century that Rashid's name reemerged with clarity. In 1981, during an archaeological excavation of Kilwa's Great Mosque, a team led by Tanzanian and German researchers uncovered a collapsed section of coral flooring. Beneath it, 3 stacked crates wrapped in decayed hide. Inside, coral slabs. They were weathered but readable. A few bore numerical carvings, ledgers of millet, sesame oil, ivory, and cloth. Others, more intriguing, bore only symbols, boats with broken sails, stylized fish, and circles intersected by waves. And at least for bore, unmistakably, Rashid's fish and quill. The slabs were difficult to interpret, but one stood out. It showed a progression of carved images, a dhow, then a fish, then a quill, followed by what looked like a stylized sun, and beneath them, scratched faintly. If it is remembered, it is not truly gone. This was not an official tax record. It was something else, a reflection, a warning, a hope. Historians debated its meaning. Some dismissed it as metaphor. Others saw it as Rashid's final attempt to speak across time. And yet, in the quiet of a museum basement, where the slabs were later stored far from the winds of Kilwa, far from the salt air and soft chisel strokes, there is something haunting in those coral etchings. They are not beautiful, not bold, but they are precise, measured, boring even. Exactly as Rashid intended. You see, Rashid was never chasing fame. His work was not meant to dazzle or dominate. He understood that the foundation of civilizations is not in their kings or battles, but in the records they keep. The ledgers, the measurements, the counting of sacks and spools. The real history, the steady beat of daily life rests in such details. We like to think that progress is dramatic. But in truth, it's often slow and scribbled. Or, in Rashid's case, carved carefully, one line at a time, into soft coral that would harden under sun and silence. Today, as Kilwa's ruins echo with the calls of seabirds and the shuffling feet of the occasional tourist, the stories told are usually grand of sultans and trade, of gold and conquest. But listen longer. Beneath the dust, beneath the chants of guides and the hum of the wind, you may still hear the scratch of a chisel. And you might ask yourself, what will remain of our own records once the ink fades and the waves return? Find yourself on a dusty rise overlooking the 17th century city of Mombasa D's, carved wooden balconies shaded by palm fronds. Its stone alleys murmuring with gossip and goat hooves. The Indian Ocean glistens in the distance, whispering to the coral walls of Fort Jesus, which looms over the harbor like a tired sentry who's seen too many flags rise and fall. But our story takes place not in the fort, not in the Sultan's palace, not even in the narrow lanes of Old Town. It begins farther inland, near the low crest of Tononoka Ridge, under a great baobab tree where no royal seals were stamped and no parchment was ever read aloud. Here, in the faint shade of its outstretched branches, gathered a group that most histories forget, the Women's Porters Guild of Mombasa. They did not have titles, no uniforms, no horses or gold rings or embroidered sashes. They wore simple. Kanga cloth tied tightly at the waist, carried bundles wrapped in goatskin, and their feet cracked from heat and time never touched anything softer than sand or broken shell. Yet they were the lifeblood of the city, a time when no wheels could survive the sand-choked paths inland, when camels were slow. And donkeys grew ill in the monsoon humidity. It was women dozens, sometimes hundreds, who carried the cargo of empire on their backs: salt, cloth, rice, gunpowder, clove oil, letters sealed with wax, ceramics from India, coins from Oman. Even Portuguese weapons were smuggled under folds of fishnet. All of it moved through their hands. They called themselves Watembezi wa Muzigo, the walkers of burdens. The world was not divided into merchants and kings, but into those who walked and those who waited. And they walked everywhere. They organized themselves in clusters of 10. Each group had a leader Wenyakit, chosen, not by age or wealth, but by memory. The woman who could best remember prices, routes, market days, and which households paid. Late was the one who led. It was said that one such leader, Mama Asha bin Omari, could recite the entire route from Mombasa to Voi 7 days' journey, inland listing every water point, every tree that grew medicinal leaves, in every village. That overcharged for mangoes? She wore a leather necklace with one small iron keyknot for a door, but for a chest buried behind her house, where she kept notes scratched into dried coconut husks, payment records, debt promises, and birth dates of guild members' children. Now, this porters' guild was not a formal union. No sultan recognized them. No colonial clerk ever filed their name. But everyone in Mombasa knew, if you needed something moved swiftly, discreetly, or safely, you called on the Watembezi. What made them powerful was not brute strength, but memory and coordination. Each morning, under the baobab, the groups met. In what they half-jokingly called Bunjia Migu Tupu, the barefoot parliament. Here, decisions were made. Not by votes, but by storytelling. If Amina from the fish market reported that the road to Kisani was flooded, the route shifted. If Fatuma mentioned that a Portuguese officer had been asking odd questions about a delivery of spices, a different group took the risk. If the moon was too bright for safe walking, remember, thieves favored full moons. They walked in staggered shifts. They carried more than goods, carried information. Much of it was boring but vital. Who had fallen ill? Which bridge was crumbling? And where a new market was being built. They whispered these things to one. Another on the walk wove them into lullabies sung under load, and encoded them into proverbs so clever that even Portuguese translators missed the true meaning. Some men scoffed, called them mere carriers, donkey women. But the Watembezi knew better. They did not shout or argue. They simply remembered who had insulted them, who had underpaid them, and who had left cargo unwrapped in the rain. Their revenge was precise and unspoken. A package delivered one day late, a shortcut no longer shared, and a secret price hike agreed upon in silence. And they knew the true terrain of empire, the footpaths, the swamp bridges, the unwritten maps drawn in memory. And sweat. Now in the year 1673, something changed. A Portuguese merchant named Francisco de Loureiro, newly arrived from Goa, attempted to bypass the porters altogether. He brought with him wheeled carts, newly built, heavy, iron-rimmed and hired laborers. From Zanzibar to haul goods through the bush, he mocked the Watembezi, called them outdated. The empire needs wheels, not feet, he declared at the spice market. The carts lasted for days. Paths turned to sludge. The wheels sank. Zanzibar laborers, unused to the biting ants and twisting footpaths of Mombasa's uplands, fled home within the week. One cart, carrying barrels of sesame oil, broke apart near Lacone. The oil soaked into the earth, drawing ants for miles. Francisco was furious. He accused the porters of sabotage. They said nothing, except Mama Asha. When summoned before the local magistrate, she arrived barefoot, as always, with her iron key around her neck. She held up a single coconut husk, on which she'd scratched a proverb. Even the elephant asks the ant where the hole is. No one could prove sabotage. No one could stop her group from walking. Francisco's carts vanished soon after. the porters stayed. By the early 18th century, the water-Mbezi system had become so efficient that some Portuguese officers secretly used them to smuggle reports and silver past corrupt governors. One even tried to document their methods, though his notes, scribbled in a mixture of Portuguese and frustrated guesses at Swahili, remain mostly indecipherable. One page simply reads, "They do not shout. They do not forget. They vanished before. I can offer coin." What made the Porters Guild remarkable wasn't defiance, or protest, or bold acts of rebellion. It was routine. The relentless, dusty, mosquito-bitten, sin-scoured routine of ordinary women who refused to be displaced not by wheels, not by officers, not even by history. And so they walked. Each morning at Tananoka Ridge, the barefoot parliament would gather. Someone would mention rain. Someone else would recall a sick relative. A baby might cry, but the loads were lifted. The roads were remembered. The day moved on. In the courtyard behind Mama Usha's home, long since overtaken by weeds and modern concrete, there was once a half-buried stone. On it, carved faintly, were a series of symbols: a footprint, a fish, a gourd, and a curved line that some say represented the baobab tree. No one has fully decoded it. Could it have been a ledger? A marker? A buried message passed between the Wadambezi and other guilds? Or simply, as one old porter's daughter suggested, a map of how we moved the world on our backs? Stood on the red dust paths leading out of Mombasa in the early 1700s, you might have thought nothing remarkable of them. Narrow, winding, littered with crushed shell, the occasional bone, and the flattened mark of a goat's passing. But to the Wadambezi, the barefoot women porters of Mombasa, these paths were not merely roads, they were memory. They remembered where thorn bushes grew too close to the bend, where the earth softened into muck after even a short rain, and where shade lasted longest when walking with a bundle in the midday sun. They could tell, from the look of the sky and the weight of their own breathing, how many hours they had before the tide rose and choked the crossing at Lacone Creek. They did not carry compasses. They carried stories. One tale passed down among them was the story of Khadija Wakipivu, a porter who once led a dozen women carrying sacks of cloves through the forest trail north to Kalalini during a season of unusual silence. The birds weren't singing, the monkeys were gone. The Wadambezi followed her anyway. Halfway through, they found a collapsed bridge where the normal trails should have run. Khadija, without stopping, veered left into what appeared to be uncut bush. The others hesitated. She pressed on. They emerged 2 hours later on the far side, without so much as a scratch. One asked how she knew. Khadija answered, "I remembered the year the bridge first cracked. The roots told me where to walk." This wasn't a metaphor. It was training. Among the Wadambezi, young porters learned from elders not through formal lessons, but through repetition. Over and over again, they walked the same routes heard, the same proverbs muttered under load, and absorbed the whispers of ground and leaf until walking itself became a kind of literacy. There was no written map. But if you looked closely at their kanga cloths, you'd sometimes find patterns that hinted at direction. A row of dots shaped like stepping stones, a line of birds stitched in a wave pattern, or a curled leaf motif representing a dangerous bend. Some scholars later speculated that these were codes route markers disguised as designs, but the porters never confirmed or denied it. They simply smiled and kept walking. In the late 1720s, however, their silence was tested in a new way. Newly appointed Omani governor, Said Al-Harthi, arrived in Mombasa with a sweeping plan to modernize the port. He intended to clear brush paths, formalize routes, and most controversially require written travel permits for all long-distance cargo carriers. This wasn't just bureaucracy. It was a kind of erasure. By making movement legible to the colonial court, the governor was trying to control the rhythm of trade. He wanted every load documented and every porter identifiable by name, village, and approved route. For the Wadambezi, this was unthinkable. Their strength was in their mobility, in being both everywhere and nowhere, in knowing routes that shifted with the seasons and paths that grew over when neglected, vanishing like footprints in wind-blown sand. But open resistance would be dangerous, punishable. So they resisted the only way they knew how. They became unreliable. Deliveries arrived late or early. Sometimes they arrived exactly on time, but to the wrong door. Permits were misplaced. Names were misspelled. Goods were recorded as delivered and then appeared again in another location. The governor suspected sabotage. He ordered an audit. Hired men to follow the Wadambezi, to trace their steps. But the men couldn't keep up. The women walked in silence. No talking, no singing, no shortcuts offered, just walking. Writing back to the governor, described the experience in frustration. They moved through the land as if it owed them passage. They did not answer questions. I asked one where we were going. She pointed at the sun and said backwards. When I asked again, she said nothing. When we arrived, it was not where I thought we would end up. Eventually, the permit system crumbled under its own weight. The paperwork outpaced the goods. Merchants grew angry. The governor relented. But not before something else had happened. The Wadambezi began holding night walks gatherings where no goods were carried and no routes were planned. Together, in silence, after dark. To outsiders, it looked like nothing. Tired women wandering. But to the Wadambezi, it was a ceremony. They walked the forgotten paths, the ones no longer used, the ones erased by the modern routes. They retraced old shortcuts, followed tree markers that no longer meant anything to anyone else, and touched stones with cracks like forgotten letters. It was called Kurudisha Njia, the returning of the way. Mama Asha was gone by then. She had died quietly, her key buried with her. But her legacy endured. At the edge of the old Tananoka meeting place, now swallowed by markets and church bells, stood the baobab tree, still rooted, still watching. One night, during a full moon, a young porter named Mojuma bin Ali carved something into the bark of that tree. Not her name, not a date, just 3 symbols. A footprint, curved line, a drop of salt. She never explained it. But decades later, during a drought, when roads were impassable and cargo stranded, a group of merchantmen climbed Tananoka Ridge to ask the Wadambezi for help. They waited in the heat. Finally, an old woman appeared barefoot, wearing a cloth with birds stitched in a spiral. She said only, "We remember the roads. Do you?" There's a kind of wisdom that settles in, the soles of the feet. For the Wadambezi wa Miziga, the women porters of Mombasa, that wisdom was neither spoken aloud nor written down. It wasn't held in ledgers or royal decrees. It was passed through calluses, through sore muscles and sun-cracked skin, and through the daily rhythm of lifting, balancing, and walking. By the late 18th century, much had changed in Mombasa. The Portuguese were long gone, replaced by the Omani Arabs, who built up the city's trade in ivory and spices. Coral mansions with mashrabia windows overlooked narrow streets. Fort Jesus still loomed, but now it flew a different flag. Ships came more often, larger and heavier, bringing with them new kinds of goods and new expectations. Still, the Wadambezi walked. The port had become busier, more formalized. Paperwork trickled in from colonial offices in Zanzibar. Bureaucrats began sketching maps of trade routes that had existed for centuries, but were only now being discovered by men with clipboards and ink-stained fingers. The porter's paths long, winding threads of memory from market to mangrove, from homestead to harbor, were slowly being redrawn, but not erased. Watembezi adapted, as they always had. Some became intermediaries, translating between bureaucrats and carriers. Others formed tightly coordinated collectives that negotiated directly with shipping agents. They were still not official, still not recognized by the governor's council. Yet somehow mysteriously, goods kept flowing when they worked, installed when they didn't. At the center of this quiet power was Mojuma bin Ali, the same woman who had once carved symbols into the baobab tree during a full moon. By now, she was nearing 60. Her legs ached in the mornings. Her back bore the slow curve of 1,000 carried loads. But she still walked, not every day, not every route. But when things got complicated, when cargo went missing or paths washed out in the rains, it was Mujuma who showed up with her quiet presence and her softly fraying cloth and simply walked the solution into being. She began keeping a pouch at her waist filled with small stones each, one representing a route or trader. She could rattle them in her hand and remember which path was passable, which merchant had underpaid, and which village had last demanded extra. It wasn't magic. It was muscle memory. One day in 1789, a coastal storm battered Mombasa, washing out 2 key roads into the interior. Trade stalled. Cargo piled up. The governor issued emergency directives, new orders for camels, and new attempts at wheel paths through swampland. Nothing worked. And then the Watembezi walked. 35 women, in 3 lines, left the port. At dawn, with loads wrapped in waterproofed palm fronds. No fanfare, no announcement, no permits. Just salt in the air and fire in their ankles. They returned before dusk, barefoot and silent, their cargo delivered to a merchant caravan stranded. Beyond the flooded crossings, when the governor summoned Mujuma for an explanation, she offered only this: the road does not ask for approval. It only asks to be remembered. A few months later, she disappeared. No ceremony, no grave. Her house was found neatly swept. Her pouch of memory stones gone. Some say she left to live inland with her niece. Others believe she walked one last path that had not been used in many years. But one thing did remain. In the shaded courtyard near Tononoka, the baobab tree stood taller than before. Carved into its bark, weathered, but still visible, was a final pattern of symbols: a drop of salt, a sandal, a flame, what looked like a circle of feet. Years later, when the colonial period deepened, missionaries arrived and found the baobab. One of them, a Dutch priest with an interest in native customs, asked a local girl what the carvings meant. She shrugged and said, "That's where the women used to remember the road." By the 19th century, the Watembezi faded from official records. Steamships and railways arrived. The rhythm of trade changed. Footpaths narrowed into ghost trails swallowed by bush or cement, but you can still see traces of them. Sometimes in the way market women stack bundles just so balanced on the crown of the head, or in the creased feet of elderly fish sellers, whose gait mirrors the long strides of their grandmothers. Or in the stories whispered by portside loaders, who talk of routes that no map can find, paths only known by rhythm and memory. The Watembezi never needed titles. Their guild was not written in charter, but in sweat. Their currency was trust. Their history walked beside them, leaving prints that lasted only until the next tide butt returned. Again and again, with each new footfall. And perhaps that is the truest kind of history. Not the one told in marble halls or gilded books, but the kind you carry in your body. It's the one that calls your feet forward even when the road vanishes. So if you ever find yourself on a dirt path, somewhere near the coast, and you spot a tree with faded carvings, pause. Listen. Not for music, not for voices, but for footsteps, soft, certain. The women are still walking. You awake to a world steeped in sympathy, sweet and sharp all at once. It is 1822 on the island of Zanzibar, and the air is thick with cloves. The monsoon has just passed, and the harvest begins. The docks hum with creaking dhows. Women in babui robes shuffle past stone homes, balancing baskets of spice on their heads. Every wooden beam, every curtain, and every crease in every man's shirt smells faintly of cloves. But beneath that scent lies another, oil used to light. Lamps after sunset in odor more subtle, slightly metallic, clinging to the hands of clerks and sailors and scribes. Together, the smell of cloves and lamp oil is the smell of an empire quietly remaking itself. Zanzibar in this moment is not yet a world power, but it is becoming one, not through war, not through steel or ships, through trees. The clove tree Sizium. Aromaticum was not native to Zanzibar, was imported from the Moluccas, the so-called Spice Islands in what is now Indonesia. The first saplings arrived in the early 19th century, smuggled or traded depending on which story you believe. brought by Omanis with sharp eyes for humid soil and trade winds. They planted them cautiously. A few test orchards nestled near the eastern coast of Unguja Island. At first, the trees seemed unimpressive. They grew slowly. They needed constant tending. The yields were erratic. Locals scoffed. Why grow these finicky trees when cassava and coconut thrived so easily? But then came a merchant named Said Khalifa. Al-Barwania, quiet man with a crooked jaw, known for walking barefoot into his own plantations and chewing raw cloves when he thought no one was looking. He wasn't a sultan, not yet. He wasn't even particularly rich, but he was patient. He purchased a neglected stretch of farmland near Chuini, on the northern edge of the island. The land had been overworked, abandoned by its owners after a dry season ruined the cassava harvest. Khalifa, against all advice, planted cloves. Hundreds of them. His neighbors laughed. Cloves required a full 5 to 8 years to mature. A whole season could be lost to salt air or a swarm of caterpillars. Who would wait that long? Khalifa would. He waited. While others traded ivory or slaves, he traded patience. He watched. Over each tree like a sick child. He employed farmers not just to plant and water, but to listen, to note how the trees responded to wind, to moisture, and to shade. He forbade plucking before the buds were properly swollen, even if prices rose. Sharply, he kept records, not on parchment, but etched into wood tablets, stacked in a corner of his storehouse. Each tablet marked a row of trees, rainfall, pests observed, and harvest weight. When one batch of trees suffered leaf wilt, he responded not with panic, but with observation. And then, in 1831, the trees bloomed. More than bloomed, they exploded. Khalifa harvested enough cloves in a single season to fill 5 empty ships. He sailed them to Muscat, to Basra, and to Bombay. The profits astronomical. Within 3 years, Khalifa went from a forgotten planter to one of the wealthiest men in East Africa. But what made his rise unusual was not the wealth itself, was how he used it. Instead of building palaces, he built nurseries for people, for trees. He taught others how to graft, distributed saplings to struggling farmers on credit treble, not in coin but in clove buds. He published again, not with ink but by word of mouth and carved signboards guidelines for spacing, watering, and pruning. It became known as Sharia Yamakifu, the law of the clove tree. It wasn't law in any formal sense. No sultan signed it. But in practice, it shaped the island. Entire villages restructured around its rhythms. Children learned to identify the right color of a bud. Women sang drying songs, lilting melodies that reminded harvesters when to turn the cloves as they dried on woven mats. Even thieves respected the trees. It was said that stealing from a clove orchard would bring coughs that never ceased. By 1837, Zanzibar exported more cloves than any other region in the world. And Khalifa, he quietly retired, handed his lands to his sons, moved into a modest coral stone house in Stonetown with squeaky shutters and no servants. He was offered a court position. He declined. But here's where the story shifts. Because though Khalifa left no throne, no monument, and no book, he left behind something stranger. An economy rooted in breath and bark, and a culture reorganized around waiting for trees, for rain, for spice, and that patience, though dull and often underappreciated, reshaped the island. By the mid-1800s, the Sultan of Oman moved his entire court to Zanzibar, not for gold, not for conquest, for cloves. Khalifa was gone by then, already part of whispered memory, but people still told his story. Children recited proverbs said to be his. Do not shout at a tree that has not bloomed. The lamp that burns too fast forgets the smell of oil. Trade is not noise, but is root and time. And somewhere in a corner of the Chuini orchard, near the oldest surviving clove trees, archaeologists once found a wooden tablet etched with strange markings, rows of dots and lines. Possibly rainfall records, possibly something else, but scratched. Along the side in faded Arabic script, we planted hope. It took root. There are places in the world where history moves loudly through. The clash of armies, the sweep of conquests, the signatures on treaties. And then there are places like Zanzibar, where history moves in silence through the planting of a tree, the drying of a bud, the tilt of the sun during clove season. By the 1840s, Zanzibar had become the undisputed heart of the global clove trade. From Brazil to Bombay, the world had developed a taste for the spice that once arrived in trickles from the AD. Molucca's butt now poured from this coral-rimmed island, like perfume from an overfilled bottle. But something curious began to happen, not with the spice itself, but with time. You see, Zanzibar did not adopt the Gregorian calendar in the usual way. It had its own rhythms, shaped less by the turning of months, and more by the rising and retreating of the monsoons. And within this tide-driven clock, cloves became a kind of metronome. The harvest season, typically from October to February, was marked not by dates, but by signs: the return of certain seabirds from Pemba Island, the first nighttime scent of overripe mangoes in the town square, the way lamp oil burned faster in the humid season, causing wicks to sputter and dim, and most famously, the deepening of the air's scent when the smell of clove drying mats overwhelmed even the sharpest fish market. Merchants didn't consult calendars. They consulted their noses. Could smell the debt season coming, one trader later said. And when the smell was strongest, you knew it was time to pay. What you adored disappear. The Sultan's officials began recording Hariri wa Carafa clove weather in ledgers that had once only tracked tide tables. Taxation patterns shifted accordingly. Tire shipping contracts were drafted using clauses like shall depart by the second wind following the first drying of buds. Zanzibar was becoming an island not just of spice, but of smell time. And here, in this sensory economy, rose a new kind of worker, though Makalenda, or calendar women. They were not scribes, nor priests, nor astronomers. They were harvest predictors. Each large plantation kept one or two. Their job? To walk the orchards before sunrise and sniff the bark, brush the soil, and watch the dew. They reported on tree behavior the way others might report on lunar phases or livestock fertility. They were mostly older women, widowed or retired from picking. Many had worked the trees for decades. They knew which orchards ripened early, which ones had deeper root beds, and how to spot a false bloom. Their predictions, though unscientific by modern standards, were alarmingly accurate. One of the most famous Makalenda was Bibi Mojabuwa, Kipanda, known simply as Bibi Moja. She walked barefoot through her plantation each morning with a sack of dried cloves around her neck, not for trade. She sniffed the dried buds like a perfumer, then compared them to what she smelled in the trees. Not ready, she'd mutter. Or too soft. Wait 5 days. Plantation owners learned to trust her word more than their own ledgers. Bibi Moja kept no notes. She insisted that memory was a more reliable tool than paper. Books forget, she once told a British merchant. Skin does not. The merchant reportedly tried to buy her scent recording method, offering gold. For a written version, she laughed and offered him a sack of clove dust. Can try to smell your way through it, she said. But the maps in the air, Zanzibar's wealth grew, so did its contradictions. By mid-century, the clove industry had become deeply entangled with the slave trade. Plantation labor was brutal, and many of the workers were enslaved. People from the mainland captured, sold, and forced to tend the very trees that scented the air. The sweet aroma of cloves masked the bitterness beneath. And yet even within that system, resilience emerged. Among the enslaved workers, knowledge of tree behavior became a tool of survival. Some deliberately misreported ripening cycles to gain rest days. Others planted secret rows of food crops between clove rows, camouflaged by their scent. Stories circulated quietly beneath the clove trees of a time when the earth would reclaim the orchards, when the smell would fade and freedom would return. In one case, a group of enslaved harvesters near Kizimbani escaped during a false bloom. Their overseer, relying on scent and guesswork, had sent most guards north for the expected early harvest. The workers slipped away south, using the cover of confusion and misaligned expectations. they were never found. Years later, one plantation manager, reflecting on this incident, remarked, "They vanished with the cloves." The scent turned, and they were gone. Not all stories are dramatic. Not all resistance is loud. Sometimes it's in the way someone walks through an orchard at dawn, refusing to write down what she knows. Sometimes it's in how a tree blooms late on purpose, or how a bud is hidden under a leaf, just long enough to buy a little time. Zanzibar in this era was more than a place. It was a smell that ruled an empire. When the monsoons blew across the harbor, shaking the dhows at anchor and carrying the clove-scented air across to the mainland, you could close your eyes and know someone was picking or drying or walking the groves with a sack of memories around her neck. But as the global market grew and the British tightened their grip on the island, change was coming. Census was commissioned. Clove output began to be regulated. Macalanda women were dismissed or reduced to assistants. Calendars were printed and distributed. The scent, of course, remained. But the timing, that beautiful, living sense of smelt him, began to fade. And that leads us to a final question. What happens when time is removed from the hands and noses of those who once carried it silently, one bud at a time? In the final years of the 19th century, Zanzibar no longer whispered as it once did. The scent of cloves was still there, still curling through alleyways, still soaking into the hair of dock workers, and perfuming the folds of freshly washed linen, but it no longer arrived like a mystery. It was catalogued, counted, scheduled. It was at last a product. No. The British, now firmly in control of the island, brought with them schedules and inspectors. Where once harvesters followed the signs of seabirds and the songs of Macalanda women, they now followed government-issued booklets that detailed bud color, soil expectations, and acceptable yield ratios. It was all very efficient. But somehow, in this pursuit of perfect production, something older began to fade, something intangible, boring, and essential. Clove drying, for example, had once been a communal act. Every neighborhood had its own Ukumbiwa Kukasha drying courtyards paved in coral stone or packed sand, where cloves were spread thin across woven mats. These mats were flipped every few hours by women humming slow songs, their rhythms aligned to the arc of the sun overhead. The scent of cloves drying in sunlight was so strong it would cling to the laundry, the skin, even the stray cats that padded across the courtyards. It was tedious, repetitive work, not glorious, not loud, but vital. Over time, the communal drying mats began to vanish. British planters built central drying houses, complete with furnaces and roofed systems that could dehydrate cloves in a fraction of the time. Quicker, yes, but sterile. The cloves still dried, but the island no longer. Smelled the same. Children who once learned the rhythms of drying from their mothers now grew up chasing schooling quotas and price regulations. Neighborhoods folded up their mats. You might walk through one of those neighborhoods today like Kapanda or Shinganian, notice nothing unusual. Coral walls, rusted gates, the quiet hush of midday sleep. But if you stand still long enough in the courtyards behind the houses, you might catch it. A faint, ghostly aroma of clove. Not strong, not immediate, but there. The past, like the spice, clings even when we no longer touch it. In the early 20th century, a British clerk named Edgar Tilling was tasked with compiling a formal botanical history of clove farming on the island. He was diligent, but uninspired. His notes preserved today in the Zanzibar archives are mostly dry, rainfall, figures, Latin classifications, and trade margins. But among his folders was one curious scrap of page of unformatted, punctuated writing, apparently dictated by a former Macalanda woman named Asha Washomari. She would have been in her 80s when Edgar found her, living alone near Chuini in a small madoned coral house. Her eyesight was poor. Her memory was not. Here's what she told him. The trees used to talk to us. We would smell when they were hungry or shy or proud. The young trees wanted attention. The old ones liked quiet. When you sit under the tree, with wet feet, it will punish you. When you dry cloves while angry, they go bitter. But the men never listened. They wanted paper answers, We gave them our silence instead. Edgar included none of this in his final report. But he underlined that page. There are no monuments to the Makalenda women, no statues of Bibi Moja or Asha Washomari. Their names, when remembered at all, appear in marginala handwritten notes, personal letters, or the whispered recollections of a niece, now old herself. Yet their impact lingers in the way certain villages in Pemba still harvest cloves with songs rather than timers. It lingers in the layout of markets, in the way elders sniff a batch of dried buds before accepting payment. It lingers in the stubborn refusal of some farmers to use fast-drying ovens, insisting that the sun has its own voice. Even now, in the humid height of harvest season, the scent of cloves will settle over Stone Town like a second skin. It slips into the folds of sailcloth and the cracks of staircases, mingles with lamp oil and fried fish, with school dust and morning sweat. It tells a story if you let it. It's not a loud one, not one with kings and cannons, but a boring story. A vital one. The story of how a tree that took 8 years to bloom reshaped the fate of an island. How memory once lived in women's feet and fingers and noses. How the world once turned, slowly, patiently, to the rhythm of scent and salt. So as dusk falls over the harbor and the sun sinks behind the rooftops, a woman in her doorway folds a mat in silence. She doesn't speak, but the smell tells her everything. She knows. In the quiet of her bones, the cloves will dry again. The island still remembers. Imagine a narrow channel of sea where currents swirl like ink in water and tidal flows reverse. Twice each day with the patient regularity of a clock. This is the strait between Lemieux Island and the mainland, the restless throat through which countless dhows have slipped over the centuries, carrying goods, dreams, and the quiet tremor of human stories. It is the year 1756, and a small trading dhow named Albacira lies anchored in Lemieux's inner harbor. Her hull is painted a sun-bleached white. Her lateen sail is furled against the mast like a tired wing. On deck, ropes coil in neat spirals. Barrels of coconut oil and sacks of rice are lashed in place. Nothing appears amiss, but Albacira will never set sail. No storm wrecks her. No pirate attack scuttles her. Instead, she is claimed silently by the sea itself, forgotten by the tide of seasons until her story becomes something more than a shipwreck. It becomes a lesson in patience, power, and the slow drift of time. Let us begin not with the dhow, but with the man who built her. His name was Said Ben Harith, a master craftsman whose reputation stretched from Pat Island to the trading posts of Malindi. He had the lean hands of a sailor and the precise eye of a sculptor, traits passed down from his father, a dhow builder, and his mother. Woodcarver who etched intricate patterns on stern beams. Said believed that a dhow was more than wood and nail. It was a living being, born of cut timber and salt air, meant to dance on waves. He consulted the elders about which mangrove trunks to choose, those grown near freshwater springs. They said were both buoyant and strong. He carved the hull with hand tools, sanding each plank until it shone like ivory in the late afternoon light. Albacira was his masterpiece, a vessel of modest size, just enough for a small crew of 8. Plus, cargo but balanced perfectly between speed and stability. Sid named her the Insightful in Swahili, believing she would reveal to him the secrets of monsoon currents. Construction was completed in early March, when the northeast monsoon still held the waters calm. The first test sail was delayed, for ceremonial reasons, a lantern lighting ceremony held on the beach at dusk to honor the sea spirits. On that evening, the women of Said's family gathered around the polished hull. Each carried a small clay lanterns, simple vessels filled with sesame oil and a cotton wick. They lit them one by one, placing them along the deck so the dhow glowed like a candle floating on the water. There was singing a low humming chant in Arabic and Swahili, each stanza invoking Baraka Yabaharini, the blessing of the sea. The flames flickered in the salt breeze, casting dancing shadows on the raised prow. Said stepped forward. He placed his own lantern at the base of the mast, then whispered a prayer that Albacira would carry her crew safely, that her keel would never breach treacherous reefs, and that she would always find favor in the tides. The ceremony ended without spectacle. The guests walked away, their lamps extinguished, leaving the dhow alone in her soft glow. Local fishermen paused to watch, but did not speak. They knew that a dhow's true trial was not in ceremony, but in seasons. In April, as the northeast monsoon waned, Said and his crew prepared to sail. Their destination, the distant port of Mastang on the Somali coast, to trade coconut oil for frankincense and cowrie shells. It was a journey of some 400 nautical miles a standard voyage, if sometimes unpredictable. But that year, the winds failed them. The old sailors whispered of an unusual low-pressure system brewing off the Gulf of Aden. The currents in the strait reversed erratically. What should have been a steady northeastern breeze dropped to a fitful whisper. The ocean's surface grew glassy, reflecting hot midday sunlight like a broken mirror. Albacira sat anchored, billowing sail useless, her hull straining against the rope that tied her to the jetty. The crew waited, day after day, watching the sea's mood shift. Sailors traded salted fish and dates for fresh milk and yams, but they did not grumble. They understood that the sea demanded respect, especially when it went silent. By mid-May, the northeast monsoon had given up entirely. The trade winds failed to return. Without wind, Albacira could not move. The crew considered rowing, but the currents here were strong, and oars would be little match for a shifting tide. They unloaded some cargo to lighten the hull. They tried every knot combination and every anchor position. Nothing worked. Meanwhile, the lanterns remained. Each night a designated crew member lit them along the Deccan homage to the ceremonies. Promise. Sometimes they burned through half a bottle of oil before dawn. Sometimes the salt spray extinguished them in minutes. The men would mutely relight, as if pleading with the sea to show mercy. Weeks turned into months. June passed, then July. The calendar advanced, but the winds did not. Albacira remained tethered in Lamu's inner harbor, slowly gathering barnacles on her keel. Local merchants grew uneasy. Goods bound for Mastang sat, unpaid for, and wharfage fees mounted. The owner of Albacira, said cousin, pressed him to sail even without wind, perhaps, by hiring maritime laborers or improvising a paddle system. Said refused. He would not risk his ship on a whim. Steady did something curious. He invited local navigators, Somali sailors, Comorian traders, even Omani helmsmen, onto Albacira one by one. Each was given handfuls of frankincense to burn on deck, the smoke intended as an offering. Each repeated his own prayers and chants. Each attempted to divine the next shifts in the currents. No one succeeded. But they did observe. They noted that the currents coming through the strait were being blocked by an underwater sandbar that had shifted during a distant cyclone off Madagascar. Sand had piled against the reef edge, altering the flow. It was a subtle, invisible change, hardly more than a whisper of sediment, but enough to disrupt the usual pattern that dhows depended upon. Somali navigators attempted to dredge around the bar, dropping makeshift scoops overboard. Comorian sailors lit driftwood fires on adjacent shoals, believing smoke would coax the tides to lift. Omani helmsmen conjured rituals to appease sea jinn. But rituals and fires could not move tons of sand overnight. As August arrived, news spread. Even large dhows from Oman had failed to pass. Trade slowed across the coast. Some merchants diverted to Kilwa or Pemba. Laman Zahaba came oddly still. Said watched quietly from his lantern-lit deck. He never blamed the sea nor the men who spoke of jinn. Simply recorded each attempt in his log, gets into a smooth plank, kept below deck. May 14th, attempted to dredge. Sand returned overnight. June 2nd, ritual by Ahmed Al-Bair, unsuccessful. July 19th, barnacle growth noted increasing below the waterline. August 3rd, the dhow, Al-Farasha, abandoned passage. August 15th, unreadable markings appeared on anchor fluke, possible coral growth. The log remains, recovered centuries later. By an archaeologist in a clay pot's planks warped, but its etchings legible. By September, Said made a decision. He ordered the crew to unload non-essential goods, fragile ceramics, excess rice, and even the teak lantern stand used for the blessing ceremony. All were stored in a warehouse near the baobab tree at Tananoka Regia, symbolic gesture, he said, to honor the stilled ship. Then, with only core supplies and essential sails stowed below, he permitted a final attempt to row Albacira out past the bar with an extra crew of 40 men. Pushing her over the troubled shoals, they tried at dawn. Oars thudded into the water. Men strained against ropes attached to the prow. But the currents, though weakened, still tugged them back. Sweat and seawater blurred their vision. After 4 days of effort, they managed to clear the bar butt by then. The sails had been shredded by sun and sand, the oars splitting under pressure. They limped back at sunset, exhausted, said ordered the dhow anchored permanently. He anchored her in a deeper channel, away from barnacles and sand, cutter lines. He never explained why. Albacira remained there for decades, a silent figure in the harbor. Local children called her the ghost dhow. Fishermen tied their nets to her rail, believing her presence brought good luck. When storms brewed, she rocked gently, almost as if nodding in approval. And as the years passed, the specifics of the sandbar's shift faded. The currents eventually returned to their ancient course, once the distant cyclone sediment settled in reefs. Reformed, but Albacira stayed bound. By the 19th century, foreign powers had carved up the coastline. Germany took Tanganyika. Britain claimed Zanzibar and the Protectorate. Colonial offices produced printed charts with fixed depth measurements. The map of currents, once living and fluid, became static. Albacira was forgotten till modern archaeologists surveyed the harbor in 1965. They found her hull preserved. Beneath layers of silt, stonefish nestling among her ribs. In her bow they uncovered said S-log plank, a clay lantern, and a rusted anchor, etched with symbols that match the carved patterns from said S family house. No one knows exactly why said chose to leave Albacira behind. Perhaps he deemed her too precious to risk on a fickle sea. Perhaps he wanted to preserve a moment in time, a testament to the oceans, power to stall even the most beautifully built vessel. Or perhaps, as his final lantern entry suggested, he meant to prove a small truth. A ship may not sail where the sea itself has paused. And so Albacira waits even now beneath the gentle waves, a silent lesson in patience and permanence, and the slow drift of seasons that no man, no matter how skilled, can outrun. When a ship waits, it learns the language of stillness. Albacira did not sail that year, but her crew became scholars of the silent sea, interpreters of the invisible forces that govern the tides and currents. The men who once saw their vessel as a tool for trade now saw her as a kind of teacher, revealing truths about time and nature that no chart or compass could capture. Days stretched into weeks. The crew grew restless, yet resigned, their lives shrinking to the bounds of the harbor. And the rhythms of the town? They developed routines not of travel but of endurance. Each morning began with the lighting of the clay lanterns, still filled with sesame oil, their flames flickering against the rising sun. The lantern light was more than tradition, it was an act of connection, a way to invite favor from the sea spirits and to hold the crew spirits steady in the face of frustration. At night, the men gathered under a baobab tree near the harbor, sharing stories of past voyages, of storms survived, and of ports reached. These tales became a thread of continuity, tying them to the broader history of seafaring along the Swahili coast. Yet beneath the camaraderie lay a quiet tension. The merchant who owned the dhow pressed for departure, the accumulated costs of docking fees and spoiled cargo weighing heavily on him. Said, however, refused to sail without the wind. There was an unspoken acknowledgement among the crew, too. Defy the sea's pause was to risk disaster. A dhow moving without the support of the monsoon winds was a fragile thing, vulnerable to capsizing or running aground on the coral reefs that ringed the coast. As the months passed, the crew's attention turned to the changing behavior of the currents themselves. They observed how the tidal flows that usually swept predictably through the strait now moved sluggishly, pooling in unexpected eddies and reversing unpredictably. Local fishermen spoke of whispering tides, currents that seemed to carry voices from distant shores, messages encoded in the patterns of waves. Some believed these tides were warnings, signals that the ocean was unsettled, that it held grudges or secrets. The crew began marking these patterns in crude charts etched into wooden boards, noting the timing of tides and the shifts in direction.
Wow.
These records were not for trade or navigation but for survival, a way to anticipate the sea's mood. Evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and lanterns flickered to life, Said sat with the crew and shared a story passed down from his father. "The sea is like a patient lover," he said softly. "It asks for respect, for time. When you try to rush, it pulls away. But when you wait, it will reveal its secrets." This philosophy of waiting was tested in unexpected ways. A month into their involuntary pause, the crew witnessed an unusual gathering of dolphins near the harbor entrance. The pods circled, leaped, and dived in patterns that seemed deliberate, almost ritualistic. Some sailors interpreted this as a sign of good fortune, a blessing that the sea spirits had not abandoned them. Others saw it as a reminder of their smallness against nature's vast forces. Mid these quiet omens, tensions with the merchant grew. Supplies dwindled. The crew's health began to waver as tropical fevers crept through the town, yet Said remained steadfast, refusing to cast off until the winds returned. Finally, after nearly 6 months of waiting, the northeast monsoon winds stirred once more. The currents resumed their ancient dance, sweeping through the strait with renewed vigor. Albacira was ready. The crew worked tirelessly to repair the sails and rigging. Lanterns burned through the nights as they prepared for departure, each flame a beacon of hope and renewal. When the first breeze filled the lateen sails, Said whispered a final prayer and cut the anchor line. The dhow moved forward, her keel carving through the water with the grace of a dancer reclaiming the stage. The journey to Mestang was slow but steady, marked by cautious optimism and deep respect for the sea's power. Upon arrival, the crew found that the trade routes had shifted during their absence, competitors had claimed markets, and prices had fluctuated wildly. But Albacira's delayed voyage was not without merit. The scarcity of goods had driven demand higher in the crews. Stories of patience and endurance added to the dhow's legend. Back in Lamu, the harbor gradually returned to its usual rhythm. But the memory of Albacira's stillness lingered, a reminder that even in the bustling life of trade and travel, moments of pause held their own profound meaning. The story of Albacira did not end with her eventual departure from Lamu's harbor. In fact, it extended far beyond the horizon, into the cultural memory of the Swahili coast and the delicate balance between human ambition and natural forces. After that fateful year, sailors, merchants, and fishermen spoke of Albacira not merely as a ship, but as a symbol, a testament to humility in the face of the sea's immense power. Shipbuilders began to incorporate this lesson into their work. The careful selection of mangrove wood, the delicate shaping of the keel, and the ritual of lantern lighting all became codified into dhow building traditions. These customs reminded builders and sailors alike that mastery over the sea was not absolute. Rather, it was a partnership, a negotiation. Generations later, a young woman named Amina, a descendant of Said S family, would recount the tale to her children under the glow of lantern light. She told them about the stillness that taught patience, about the invisible sandbar that changed the currents, and about the importance of listening to the ocean's whispers. She taught them that not all journeys required movement, that sometimes waiting was the greatest voyage. Archaeological discoveries in the late 20th century revived Albacira's story in scholarly circles. The recovered log plank provided rare insight into 18th century dhow navigation and local understandings of oceanography. The clay lantern found on deck became a symbol of hope and resilience in museum exhibits dedicated to Swahili maritime heritage. But beyond academic interest, Albacira's legacy survives in the very rhythms of life on the coast. Fishermen still respect the changing currents, reading them as messages rather than obstacles. Lantern lighting ceremonies continue during certain festivals, honoring the sea spirits and the ancestral bonds between people and water. And in moments when the winds falter and the tides hold their breath, there are those who remember that a dhow once waited anchored, not by ropes, but by the patient embrace of time itself. In a world often rushing toward conquest and progress, Labasira reminds us of the quiet power in surrender, the enduring value of patience, the subtle lessons whispered by the ocean's depths. You find yourself walking the narrow alleyways of Lamu, a quiet town on the northern coast of Kenya. The sun has just dipped below the horizon, and the streets begin to glow out with electricity. But with soft, amber light spilling from lanterns hung on carved wooden brackets outside each home. The lanterns flicker gently, casting elongated shadows that dance on the coral stone walls. In these quiet moments, you might wonder about the hands that made these lanterns, the artisans who shaped raw metal and glass into vessels that could hold both light and hope. But if you look deeper, you find their stories are almost invisible. Lost in the folds of time, much like the faint glow of their craft after dawn, the lantern makers of Lamu were a small, secretive community known as the Marafiki Wata, or Friends of Light. Their craft was essential to the town's rhythm. Before the age of electric bulbs and generators, every household relied on their lanterns for evening prayers, late-night storytelling, and the occasional celebration. Yet when the British colonial administration conducted a census in the early 20th century, these lantern makers were barely counted, if at all. They lived and worked in narrow alleys tucked behind the bustling markets, their workshops hidden behind unassuming doors. Many were itinerant craftsmen, moving between towns along the coast, making it difficult for colonial officials to categorize them. One such maker was Hassan ibn Rashid, an elder whose family had passed down the art of lantern making for generations. Hassan's workshop was a cramped space filled with tools that gleamed with a dull metallic sheen, hammers, anvils, files, and a collection of glass panels, some colored faint blue or green. He spoke little of his past, but when he did, his voice was as steady as the flame he carefully lit each evening. Hassan's lanterns were not merely functional objects. They were works of art. The metal frames bore intricate geometric patterns, inspired by the designs of nearby mosques and the interlaced motifs found on Swahili fabrics. Each glass panel was painstakingly cut to fit, held in place with precision so that the lantern would cast not just light, but patterns that transformed the dark. His workshop smelled of oil and molten metal, and sometimes the air was thick with the dust of coral stone from nearby quarries. The sound of hammering was a familiar background to the town's evening chorus of calls to prayer and sea breezes rustling palm fronds. Hassan did not work for money alone. His lanterns were often gifts to neighbors, friends, or as dowries. The making and giving of lanterns was deeply embedded in the social fabric of Lamu. They symbolized connection, warmth, and the continuity of light in times, both ordinary and extraordinary. But life was not easy for the Marafiki Wata. The increasing presence of colonial administrators brought new regulations, taxes, and an emphasis on formal employment. Traditional crafts like lantern making were seen as outdated or irrelevant. Markets flooded with imported lanterns made in Europe, cheaper, mass-produced, and often less durable. Hassan and his peers faced a slow erosion of their trade. Younger generations were drawn to the promises of schools and government jobs. The quiet art of lantern making risked fading into obscurity, like the soft flicker of candlelight being replaced by harsh electric bulbs. One evening, as Hassan finished assembling a delicate lantern for a wedding, he paused to reflect on the changes sweeping through his town. He wondered whether future generations would remember the care it took to shape metal and glass by hand, or the meanings that those lanterns carried beyond mere illumination. Outside his workshop, the lanterns continued to glow, small beacons in the deepening night. They whispered stories of resilience, craftsmanship, and the subtle ways in which light can connect people across time. But as dawn approached, the soft glow faded, and with it, a question lingered. What happens to the stories of those who craft light when the light itself is replaced? The glow of Hassan's lanterns continued to warm the streets of Lamu, but behind the scenes, a quieter, less visible shift was taking place. The British colonial administration's census was more than a count of people. It was an assertion of control, a way to impose order on the sprawling networks of communities that had long existed on the coast. Yet in the process, some lives and livelihoods were overlooked or misunderstood. Hassan's name did not appear clearly in the census records, Neither did the names of many of the Marafikiwa. Ta. They were lumped into broad occupational categories or simply recorded as unclassified. Artisans. Their workshops were not noted on maps. Their trade was often dismissed as a minor craft, insignificant in the eyes of colonial officials focused on revenue and administration. This absence from official records had consequences. Without formal recognition, the lantern makers had no legal protections or rights. Their products were undervalued in emerging markets that favored imported goods. Their workshops faced taxation without representation, and their traditional social roles were marginalized. Despite these challenges, Hassan and his community persevered. They organized informal apprenticeships, passing knowledge down through families. The making of lanterns remained a secret language, spoken in the flicker of flames and the clink of metal. In the narrow alleyways, lantern making became not just a craft, but an act of quiet resistance, a way to preserve identity and continuity amid the forces of change. But change was relentless. Electricity arrived in Lemieux in the mid-20th century, slowly at first, powering government offices and colonial buildings. With it came electric street lamps that promised brighter, steadier light. The soft amber glow of Hassan's lanterns began to seem dim and outdated. Customers dwindled. The younger generation sought education and jobs outside traditional crafts. Workshops closed or shifted to making simpler metal goods. Hassan watched as his town's nights grew brighter but colder. The lanterns still hung, but more as ornaments than necessities. In his final years, Hassan recorded his memories in oral stories told to his grandchildren. He spoke of the importance of light not just for seeing but for connecting, for marking time, and for creating community. He lamented the census that had forgotten them, the administration that valued numbers over nuance, and the future that seemed to turn its back on old ways. Yet, even as the last lantern was lit in his workshop, Hassan held on to a quiet hope that light, no matter its source, carries stories worth remembering. Decades after Hassan ibn Rashid's workshop fell silent, the narrow streets of Lemieux still carry the faint echoes of his craft. Electric bulbs now line the alleys, their harsh white light stark against the coral stone walls. Yet, on special occasions, the Islamic festival of Eid or the town's annual dhow sailing competition, lanterns are lit once more, suspended carefully from wooden brackets or carried by hand. These moments are more than nostalgia. They are acts of remembrance, quiet nods to a time when light was a crafted gift, and lantern makers like Hassan were the keepers of that light. In recent years, local historians and cultural preservationists have sought to reclaim the stories lost in colonial archives. Oral histories from Hassan's descendants and other Marafiki Wata families have been recorded, highlighting the vital role lantern makers played in the social and spiritual fabric of Lemieux. Exhibitions have displayed lanterns crafted in traditional styles, often restored or replicated using old techniques. These artifacts speak to resilience and continuity, bridge between a forgotten past and a future that still values heritage. But there remains a poignant question. How does a community remember those who were never fully counted? Honor craftsmen whose names were omitted from the official records, whose contributions were invisible to those in power. The answer is found in the light itself. Each flickering flame, whether from a centuries-old lantern or a modern replica, carries a story. It speaks of patience, skill, and the human need to create warmth and connection in the darkness. And so, when the lanterns are lit in Lemieux's quiet streets, they do more than illuminate the path. They whisper of those forgotten by censuses, but remembered in the glow, the Marafiki Wata, the Friends of Light. Their legacy lives on, not just in metal and glass, but in the very act of lighting a lamp in the night. Imagine a marketplace nestled at the edge of a Swahili port town, where the air is thick with the scent of dried fish, crushed spices, and the faint saltiness of the nearby sea. Around you, traders from distant lands speak in a jumble of languages: Swahili, Arabic, Persian, and Gujarati, each voice adding to the constant hum of commerce. This is the Soko La Bahari, the sea market, a place where fortunes were made, not by spectacle, but by quiet calculation, and where the ordinary lives of salt harvesters, sandalwood traders, and silver merchants intertwined in ways few recorded. The market's heart was a vast baobab tree, its enormous trunk scarred by centuries of traders carving their marks or hanging small offerings. Underneath its broad canopy, merchants laid out wares on woven mats, clumps of raw salt glistening like tiny crystals, heaps of sand for construction, and delicate silver coins minted in distant lands. Among them was Moinity, a salt harvester whose life was ruled by tides and seasons. Her mornings began before dawn, trekking to nearby salt flats where seawater pooled in shallow basins. The water was left to evaporate under the equatorial sun, leaving behind salt crusts that she carefully scraped and gathered. This was laborious, exhausting work, but essential for preserving food and seasoning dishes across the region. Salt was more than a commodity. It was a form of currency. Moinati's salt would trade for millet from inland farmers, for textiles from Indian traders, or for silver coins that jingled in her small leather pouch. At the market, she met Juma, a silver merchant who had journeyed from Mogadishu. Wares included finely crafted coins and jewelry, prized for their purity and design. Juma understood the value of trust more than gold itself. His customers were loyal because he honored debts and ensured fair exchange, qualities that mattered in the ebb and flow of coastal trade. But the market was more than barter. It was a place where knowledge passed like currency, stories of distant ports, news of monsoon schedules, and advice on avoiding pirate raids. Traders like Moinity and Juma lived in the interstices of these exchanges, shaping the fate of the town in ways both visible and hidden. Despite its vibrancy, the Soko La Bahari was often overlooked by official chroniclers. It was seen as chaotic, too ordinary to merit detailed description. But within its slow rhythms lay the beating heart of the Swahili coast's economy and social life. And yet, even this bustling market faced threats: shifting trade routes, colonial interference, and environmental changes that altered the availability of salt and other goods. As the sun rose higher, casting sharp shadows beneath the baobab, Moinity paused, wiping sweat from her brow. She wondered whether the delicate balance that held her world together, the tides, the trust, the slow trade, would endure, or if, like so many other forgotten places, the market's pulse would one day fade to silence. The Soko La Bahari was more than just a place of goods. It was a crossroads of connections, webs spun carefully across land and sea that tied the local salt harvester, Moinity, two merchants, sailors, and officials. Scattered across the Swahili coast and beyond, salt, the product of her labor, was deceptively simple. It was the preservation of fish, the flavoring of rice, and the spark in a stew that turned hunger into satisfaction. But salt was also a symbol, a currency, and a means of survival in a world where food scarcity and spoilage threatened entire communities. In the early 19th century, Moinati's market was caught in a slow transformation. Trade patterns shifted as European powers extended their reach into the Indian Ocean, bringing new goods, taxes, and regulations that complicated long-established networks. Juma, the silver merchant, found his routes increasingly disrupted. Customs. Officials imposed tariffs on imported coins and jewelry, cutting into profits. Some traders resorted to clandestine dealings, moving goods under cover of night to avoid colonial scrutiny. Yet, despite these pressures, the market endured. The baobab tree remained a silent witness to exchanges, coins changing hands, salt piled high, and sand traded for construction of new homes and dhows. Moinati's role extended beyond harvesting. She was a vital part of a social contract. Her knowledge of the tides and salt flats was indispensable to planning harvests and anticipating shortages. She negotiated with traders from inland, coordinating supply chains that balanced demand and supply delicately. The salt harvesters' days were long and hot, but their influence rippled quietly through the economy. Without their work, food preservation would falter. Trade in fish and other perishables would collapse, and the fragile equilibrium of coastal life would destabilize. At the same time, the market's sand used for building coral houses and Reinforcing dhows was itself a resource that demanded stewardship. Overharvesting threatened erosion, and disputes occasionally erupted between harvesters, merchants, and local leaders about access and rights. These slow-moving conflicts were rarely recorded but shaped the social fabric of the town. They demanded negotiation, patience, and resilience, qualities embodied by people like Munadi and Juma. As the monsoon winds shifted and the tides turned, the market pulsed with quiet urgency, goods moving, debts exchanged, and relationships negotiated. The rhythm was subtle, but vital, a heartbeat beneath the grand narratives of empire and conquest. Yet, as the shadows lengthened beneath the baobab, an unresolved question remained. How much of this delicate system of trade and trust could survive the coming storms of colonialism and modernization? The colonial tide did indeed surge, reshaping the Swahili coast in ways both visible and subtle. Customs houses sprouted, new taxes carved margins, and imperial maps redrew boundaries. Yet beneath these changes, the heartbeat of the market beneath the baobab persisted, albeit altered. IDs. Salt harvest became more precarious. Colonial authorities regulated access to salt flats, introducing permits and fees that few locals could afford. Some salt workers migrated to nearby plantations, while others adapted, trading smaller quantities or shifting to other labor. Silver trade was similarly constrained. Imported European coins flooded the market, devaluing traditional currencies. Jewelry styles shifted, reflecting new fashions and colonial influences. Trust, once the foundation of trade, was tested by new legal frameworks and economic pressures. Still, the market's rhythms endured in quieter ways. Neighborhood markets thrived, and barter systems persisted where formal currency faltered. Informal networks kept alive stories, recipes, and rituals linked to the sea and land. The baobab tree itself remained a symbol of continuity, its thick trunk weathering centuries of change, its branches sheltering generations of traders and dreamers. In modern times, researchers and local elders have worked to record these stories, recognizing the importance of the ordinary lives that shaped history. Archaeologists have uncovered remnants of salt pans and coins, tracing the economic lifelines of forgotten markets. And though the pace of life has quickened and modernity has spread, the lessons of the market remain, that survival depends not only on wealth, but also on the patience of tides, the balance of exchange, and the trust woven quietly through community. As you leave the market beneath the baobab, the scent of salt and spices lingers, and the faint glint of silver catches your eye. And you might wonder, in the grand sweep of history, how many such markets, quiet, essential, overlooked, have shaped the world we live in today. Before the engines of steamships churned the waters of the Indian Ocean, before the bustling ports echoed with the clang of metal and the shouts of distant crews, the Swahili coast lived to the pulse of the tides and the hum of small wooden dhows. The fishermen who ventured out each day carried with them a deep understanding of the seas, temperament and knowledge passed down through generations, often unrecorded but vital to survival. Imagine standing at the edge of a quiet beach near the forgotten port town, just as the first pink light of dawn brushes the horizon. The air is cool and salty, scented with seaweed and damp sand. Small boats carved from mangrove and coated with resin to repel water rest on the shore, their sails furled tightly, waiting for the day's journey. Among the fishermen is Abdulrahman, a middle-aged man with skin weathered by sun and salt, whose eyes reflect both the calm and fury of the ocean. Abdulrahman's life is dictated by patterns few outsiders notice: the phases of the moon, the winds of the monsoon, and the migrations of fish beneath the waves. Each morning, he performs a ritual offering, a small prayer to Munguwa Baharini, the god of the sea. This act is quiet but profound, a moment to seek protection and guidance. Then, with his crew, he prepares nets woven from palm fibers, sharpened, hooks crafted with care, and a small clay jar of water for ritual cleansing. The boats themselves are marvels of practical design. Their hulls are narrow and flexible, built to withstand coral reefs and sudden gusts. The lateen sela triangular, piece of cloth ease, hoisted carefully to catch the steady trade winds, allowing for swift travel along the coast. Abdul Rahman and his crew set out, just as the sun begins to rise, paddling past coral outcrops and mangrove-lined inlets. They fish not for sport or commerce alone, but for sustenance, a daily negotiation with the sea's generosity. Their catch varies with the seasons. Small reef fish during the calm months. Larger pelagic species when the monsoon winds bring different currents. The men know when to avoid certain waters, wary of storms or the presence of predators. Back on shore, the community waits quietly. Women prepare to clean and dry fish. Children play beneath the shade of coconut palms. And elders recount tales of ancestors who braved the ocean's moods. Life is cyclical and measured, punctuated by the tides and the slow dance of moonlight. On water, it is a life of patience, endurance, and subtle skill, far from the noisy rush of modern ports, but no less essential to the fabric of coastal society. Yet this quiet world was soon to face a profound disruption. The arrival of steamships promised speed and new trade routes, but also challenged the rhythms that fishermen like. Abdul Rahman had lived by for centuries. Before that disruption, however, fishermen's lives were marked by an unchanging connection to the sea relationship that shaped not just their livelihood, but their identity. And here, you might ask yourself, how did these quiet lives navigate the vast changes that would sweep the coast in the centuries to come? As the sun climbed higher, Abdul Rahman and his crew settled into the steady rhythm of their work, each movement practiced and precise. Fishing along the Swahili coast was a delicate balance of skill, observation, and respect for the sea's changing moods. The nets they used were hand-woven from palm fibers, surprisingly strong and flexible. These nets were not cast haphazardly. Instead, their deployment required intimate knowledge of fish behavior, tidal patterns, and underwater geography. Abdul Rahman would often send a younger crew member to scout for sign schools of fish breaking the water's surface, the flight of seabirds, or the color shifts in shallow reefs. Navigation relied on far more than the stars or the sun. The fishermen read subtle cues, the scent of the air, the feel of the wind, even the taste of the salt spray on their lips. Such skills were honed from childhood, passed down orally through stories and hands-on training rather than written maps. Night fishing was particularly challenging and required heightened awareness. Lanterns made from dried coconut shells or crude clay held flickering flames to attract fish or illuminate nets. The fishermen worked in near silence, mindful of not disturbing the fragile balance of the marine environment. Their catch was modest, but reliable. A variety of reef fish, octopus, crabs, and occasionally sea turtles. The fish would be salted or dried on racks, a preservation method crucial for surviving lean months and for trade. Life at sea was not without danger. Sudden storms could overturn boats. Hidden coral reefs were treacherous to navigate. The presence of pirates or rival fishermen sometimes led to conflict. Yet the sea was also a source of community and continuity, a space where skills and traditions were reaffirmed daily. On shore, the fish were sold or bartered. Women played a key role in processing and marketing, shaping the local economy. The social fabric of coastal towns depended on these interconnected roles, creating a complex web of interdependence. This age-old system stood on the cusp of change. The arrival of steam-powered vessels in the late 19th century would soon disrupt these rhythms. Faster ships meant new markets, new competitors, and altered fishing grounds. The delicate balance Abdul Rahman knew so well faced new pressures. Still, the knowledge embedded in these quiet lives of tides, fish, and survival would endure, even if transformed. As the night falls over the coast, and lanterns flicker on fishing boats, bobbing gently, one might ponder, what becomes of ancient knowledge when the world changes faster than the tides? The arrival of steamships along the Swahili coast introduced a new chapter, one filled with promise and uncertainty. These iron vessels, powered by engines rather than wind, could traverse the ocean faster and carry larger cargoes. They opened new trade routes and brought distant markets closer. But they also disrupted the rhythms that fishermen, like Abdul Rahman, had known for generations. Many fishermen found their traditional fishing grounds overfished or restricted as steamship routes carved through the waters. Competition intensified. And colonial authorities often prioritized large-scale commercial ventures over small, community-based livelihoods. Abdulrahman, now older and wiser, witnessed these changes with a mixture of resignation and resolve. Though the world around him was shifting, he held on to the wisdom passed down by his ancestors, the silent language of tides and stars. The patience required to read the sea's moods. Some fishermen adapted, venturing further out or learning to trade their catch in new markets. Others resisted, preserving their ways in quiet pockets where the hum of engines could not reach. The community's resilience was reflected not just in survival, but in subtle adaptation. Songs were sung that mourned lost ways, but celebrated enduring ties. Festivals honored the sea and those who lived by it. The knowledge of tides, seasons, and fish migration remained a sacred inheritance. Today, the legacy of these quiet fishermen lingers in coastal villages where traditional dhows still sail alongside motorboats, where lanterns still light evening prayers, and where stories of the sea connect past and present. In the slow, rhythmic dance between ocean and shore, between old ways and new, you can sense the persistence of human connection to nature's cycles. And so, as you watch a wooden dhow glide silently over the calm waters at dusk, you might wonder, how do communities carry forward the quiet wisdom of their ancestors in a world that never stops changing? Imagine walking along the narrow streets of a Swahili town, where the buildings seem to rise organically from the earth walls of pale coral stone gleaming softly in the afternoon sun. These structures are silent witnesses to centuries of history. They're stones shaped by hands, both skilled and patient. The coral masons, known locally as the Ynziwa Mayamba, were artisans whose craft combined knowledge of the sea and the earth. Unlike the marble and granite of distant lands, the coral stone they worked with was porous and fragile. Harvested carefully from reef formations offshore and shaped into blocks for homes, mosques, and public buildings. This stone was a gift from the ocean, but taking it required respect and precision. The masons timed their harvesting during low tides, working with simple tools, chisels, hammers, and wooden wedges to cut and transport blocks back to the shore. Among these craftsmen was Jalil, a man whose quiet demeanor concealed a deep pride in his work. His family had been masons for generations, passing down techniques that blended craftsmanship with a profound understanding of the reef's ecology. Jalil's workshop was near the water's edge, where coral blocks lay drying in the sun, their rough surfaces softened by salt and sand. He would begin each day by inspecting the reef tides, ensuring that his work did not endanger the fragile marine environment upon which his livelihood depended. Building with coral was an art of patience. Each block had to be cut just right, too rough, and it would crumble. Too smooth, and it might lose strength. Walls were constructed thick, allowing for the stone's porous nature while providing insulation. From the equatorial heat, beyond their practical function, these coral walls carried cultural significance. The patterns carved into doorways and window frames reflected Swahili aesthetics, geometric shapes, Arabic calligraphy, and motifs inspired by the natural world. Yet the masons' work was often overlooked in the grand narratives of history. Their silent walls stood firm, but the men who built them remained nameless in the chronicles of empires and trade. Jalil understood this well. He labored not for fame, but for community, knowing that his stones would shelter families, protect sacred spaces, and endure through generations. As you trace your fingers along the cool surface of a coral wall, you might wonder, what stories lie hidden within these silent stones, and how do they shape the lives of those who live within their embrace? Jalil's mornings began before the sun crested the horizon, when the sea was calm and the tide low. This was the moment when the coral reefs revealed themselves, stretches of rough, jagged stone visible above the waterline, ready to be harvested. Coral harvesting was no casual endeavor. It required a keen eye and respect for the ocean's delicate balance. Over-harvesting risked damaging the reef ecosystem, which not only sustained marine life, but also protected the coastline from erosion. Using simple but effective tools, chisels fashioned from iron and wooden wedges. Jalil and his team carefully extracted coral blocks. The work was exhausting and sometimes dangerous. Slippery rocks, sharp coral edges, and the rising tide imposed strict limits on time and safety. Once extracted, the coral was hauled to drying yards near the shore, where the blocks would rest for weeks, allowing salt to crystallize and the stone to harden. This process was essential to ensure the longevity of the buildings constructed from them. Back in the town, Jalil's craftsmanship transformed these rough blocks into precise building materials. The coral's porous nature allowed walls to breathe, regulating interior temperatures and humidity in an environment often hot and humid. Building a coral house was a communal effort. Families pooled resources and labor, with masons like Jalil leading the skilled work. Walls were thick and roofs were often flat and made from mangrove poles and palm fronds, which building reflected. A blend of African, Arab, and Persian influences and architectural testimony to the cultural fusion that defined the Swahili coast. Despite the beauty and utility of their work, coral masons were rarely recognized beyond their towns. They were often considered humble laborers, their artistry overshadowed by the wealthier merchants who commissioned the buildings. Jalil accepted this, quietly focusing, instead, on the pride that came from shaping stone that would shelter generations. The walls he built held memories, whispered prayers, and everyday life stories often invisible to outsiders but deeply felt within the community. Yet, even as Jalil worked, he was aware of change looming on the horizon. Colonial authorities began regulating coral harvesting, sometimes restricting access. New materials like imported cement and bricks started to appear, promising modernity, but threatening traditional crafts. The rhythm of stone and tide, the steady, measured pace that had defined Jalil's life, was about to face a challenge. And as you watch the sun set over coral walls glowing warmly in the evening light, you might wonder, how do communities balance preservation and progress when the very stones beneath their feet begin to shift? As the tides of the 20th century advanced, the coral masons of the Swahili coast, including Jalil, faced a world transformed by colonial rule, modernization, and new technologies. The delicate balance between tradition and change became a daily negotiation. Imported materials, like cement and concrete, became widely available, promising durability and speed in construction. Wealthy merchants and colonial administrators favored these new materials, seeing them as symbols of progress and modernity. The coral stone, once the backbone of coastal architecture, was increasingly seen as outdated. Yet in many towns, the coral walls remained standing, quiet, resilient, and full of stories. Jalil, though older and no longer able to work the reefs himself, watched as younger masons adapted, sometimes blending old techniques with new materials. Some resisted change, preserving traditional methods as acts of cultural identity and environmental stewardship. The community's respect for coral masonry endured in festivals and storytelling, where elders recounted the art and its significance. The architecture itself, masks, homes, and public buildings, became living museums, testaments to the skill and patience of generations. In recent decades, efforts have been made to preserve coral-built heritage sites. Recognizing their historical and environmental importance, conservationists study the coral structures not only for their beauty, but for their natural cooling properties and sustainability, lessons relevant even today. Jalil's legacy, and that of the coral masons like him, is written not only in stone, but also in the resilience of communities that continue to live in and honor these spaces. Their work reminds us that history is built slowly, layer by layer, much like coral reefs themselves. As you pass by the silent walls under the evening sky, you may feel the weight of centuries resting, their stones shaped by hands that understood patience, respect, and the intertwined fate of sea and stone. Perhaps you will reflect, in a rapidly changing world, how do the foundations laid by ordinary hands shape the future we inhabit? Along the Swahili coast, where the land meets the ocean, there once thrived a quiet but essential craft, the weaving of indigo-dyed cloth. This art was the lifeblood of communities, connecting daily life, trade, and identity, in ways that often went unnoticed by history's grand narratives. Imagine a small workshop tucked away behind a bustling market, its air thick with the scent of wet earth and plant dye. Here, women and men sat bent over wooden looms, their hands deftly moving threads of cotton, preparing to transform raw fiber into vibrant cloth. Among them was Amina, a master weaver whose skill with indigo dye was renowned in her town. The process was painstaking. Indigo leaves were harvested and fermented to produce the deep blue pigment, which was then carefully applied to cloth through repeated dipping and drying. The resulting hues varied from pale sky blues to rich, almost black shades. Indigo cloth was more than fabric, it was a symbol. Worn during ceremonies, given as gifts, and traded along coastal routes, represented connection, status, and cultural expression. The weavers operated in close-knit communities, their knowledge passed down through generations. They balanced artistic creativity with practical concerns, creating cloth durable enough for everyday use, yet beautiful enough to command respect in social settings. Yet, despite their vital role, the weavers remained largely invisible and official histories. Their labor was domestic and local, overshadowed by the spectacle of grand trade and politics. Amina's workshop, filled with the gentle rhythm of weaving and the soft smell of dye, was a world unto itself, a place where tradition and resilience intertwined. As the loom threads crossed and twisted under her fingers, Amina reflected on the importance of her craft in a changing world. Imported textiles from Europe began to flood markets, challenging the weaver's livelihood. Yet the deep blue of indigo held a stubborn place in the hearts of many. And so, in the quiet of her workshop, Amina held a question. How does a craft survive when the world around it is woven with new threads? Amina's indigo workshop thrived on traditions that blended ancient techniques with a keen understanding of her environment. The indigo plant, Indigofera tinctoria, was cultivated in nearby fields, its leaves carefully harvested during specific seasons to maximize pigment potency. The dyeing process was a delicate alchemy. Leaves were soaked and fermented in large clay vats, producing a thick blue liquid. The cloth, often cotton, woven by hand or imported from nearby regions, was repeatedly dipped and dried to deepen its color. The more dips, the richer the blue each cloth, a subtle record of time and care. Indigo cloth had many uses: everyday garments, ceremonial robes, and trade goods. It was prized not just for its color, but for its durability and the stories embedded in its patterns. Each motif, woven or dyed into the fabric, carried meaning symbols of identity, social status, or protection. Yet by the 19th century, Amina and her fellow weavers faced growing challenges. European manufactured textiles flooded coastal markets, offering cheap, mass-produced fabrics that undercut traditional cloth. Imported dyes promised faster, more consistent colors, but lacked the depth and cultural resonance of indigo. Despite this, Amina held firm. The weaving community valued not only the product, but also the process and act of cultural preservation and resistance. Workshops became places where stories, songs, and techniques were shared, keeping the craft alive even as economic pressures mounted. Trade routes that once linked Swahili ports to the interior and beyond shifted under colonial influence. Markets fragmented, and with them, the social networks that supported crafts like weaving. Younger generations were drawn to new occupations, leaving fewer to carry on the dyeing traditions. Still, indigo cloth retained symbolic power. It appeared in weddings, religious ceremonies, and as markers of community identity. Its deep blue hues continued to tell stories that imported fabrics could not. Amina understood the fragile balance between survival and change. Her workshop was a sanctuary, a place where time slowed and the threads of history were woven one by one. As dusk settled and the vats of dye cooled, she wondered, can the colors of the past endure when the market paints with new shades? The 20th century unfolded. The indigo weaving tradition on the Swahili coast experienced both decline and quiet resilience. Industrial textiles and synthetic dyes increasingly dominated markets, reshaping tastes and availability. The once thriving workshops, where Amina and her peers labored, faced dwindling demand, and the migration of younger generations toward urban centers. Yet, within pockets of coastal villages, the craft endured. Elders taught children the rhythms of weaving and the secrets of dye vats, preserving not only a method, but also a cultural memory. Indigo cloth continued to hold ceremonial significance, appearing at weddings, funerals, and religious festivals. In recent decades, a renewed interest in traditional crafts has sparked efforts to document and revive indigo weaving. Organizations and historians have collaborated with local artisans to record techniques and celebrate the rich symbolism woven into the fabric. Kena's legacy, carried forward by these renewed efforts, reminds us that history is not only told by grand events, but also by the ordinary hands that create beauty and meaning in everyday life. As you imagine the deep blue threads twisting through time, you might reflect, in a world quick to forget, how do the quiet colors of culture continue to dye our collective story? Along the Swahili coast, long before telegraphs or radios, communication, across vast distances depended on the rhythms of nature, especially the monsoon winds that swept steadily over the Indian Ocean. These seasonal winds were more than weather. They were the lifeblood of maritime networks that connected distant ports, enabled trade, and carried news and messages. Imagine a small dhow, its lateen sails billowing gently, gliding silently over the turquoise waters. On board is Salim, courier entrusted with carrying letters and parcels between coastal towns and faraway cities like Kilwa, Zanzibar, and beyond. Salim's journey is long and unpredictable, dictated by the timing of the monsoon and the vagaries of the sea. Cargo is fragile words inscribed on parchment or palm leaves, wrapped carefully in waterproof bundles. These messages carried not just commercial orders, but also personal letters, legal documents, and diplomatic missives. Salim's role was crucial, yet often overlooked. Without him, the fragile networks of trust and commerce that sustained the Swahili coast would falter. He relied on the steady trade winds, navigating by stars, currents, and his intimate knowledge of coastal geography. Travel was fraught with challenges. Pirates prowled the waters, storms could appear suddenly, and the risk of shipwreck was ever present. Yet Salim and others like him persisted, driven by duty and the recognition that they were the threads binding communities across the ocean. On shore, families awaited news sometimes for weeks or months. See each message a lifeline. The arrival of a courier could bring relief, joy, or sorrow, reflecting the full spectrum of human experience. This system of communication was part of a larger tapestry of maritime culture where trade, diplomacy, and daily life were interwoven by the wind and sea. Yet this delicate balance faced disruption as colonial powers introduced new technologies and controls, changing the flow of information and power along the coast. As Salim's dhow sliced through the waves beneath the vast sky, you might ask yourself, how did these silent couriers shape the bonds of distant communities before modern communication? Salim's journeys were marked not only by the physical challenge of traversing the vast Indian Ocean, but also by the intricate social and political networks he navigated. The monsoon winds dictated a strict calendar. The southwest monsoon carried sailors southward from May to September, while the northeast monsoon reversed the course from November to March. Timing was everything. Couriers like Salim had to be attuned to the wind's fickle nature. Leaving too early or too late could mean getting caught in dangerous storms or missing vital seasonal trade fairs. Salim's knowledge was as much oral tradition as practical skill, passed down through generations. Along the way, Salim stopped at ports and bustling. Others quiet where messages were handed over, exchanged, or delayed due to political unrest or weather. Each port had its own customs, officials, traders, and rulers, all part of a fragile equilibrium that couriers had to respect and understand. These stops were not mere interruptions, but essential exchanges. Salim often acted as a messenger between distant authorities, delivering decrees or negotiating safe passage. His presence required trust and diplomacy, skills honed over years. Meanwhile, the letters themselves carried stories, pleas for aid. declarations of marriage, notices of shipment delays, and reports on the health of family members. They chronicled the rhythms of daily life, the ambitions of traders, and the anxieties of rulers. But as colonial powers asserted control over coastal regions, this traditional network faced increasing challenges. New regulations restricted movement, and the introduction of telegraph cables in the late 19th century began to replace the need for physical couriers. Salim's role became precarious, caught between ancient customs and modern innovations. Yet, the social bonds he maintained through his travels persisted, embedded in the memories and oral histories of coastal communities. As night falls and stars appear guiding ships and dreamers alike, you might wonder what happens to a network of trust when the winds of change blow in new directions. With the dawn of the 20th century, the age of silent couriers like Salim quietly came to a close. Telegraph cables, steamships, and colonial administration networks redefined communication across the Indian Ocean, accelerating information flow, but also imposing new controls. The intimate human connection once carried on wooden dhows gave way to impersonal wires and distant operators. Yet the legacy of these couriers endured beneath the surface of coastal life. The trust networks they wove between families, traders, and rulers continued to influence social relationships and economic practices. Oral histories remember the courage of men like Salim, who braved storms and piracy to carry messages vital to the fabric of Swahili society. In villages and towns, stories passed down through generations speak of the anticipation felt upon a courier's arrival, the relief of receiving news, and the bonds strengthened by shared knowledge. Modern scholars have begun to appreciate the sophistication of these maritime communication systems, recognizing them as precursors to today's global networks. As you imagine the dhow slicing through monsoon winds, carrying whispers of distant lands and heartfelt messages, you might reflect. How do the quiet acts of connection carried on the wings of wind and wave shape the course of history? Even as new technologies change the way we communicate, along the dusty lanes and coral stone streets of Swahili port towns, hidden gardens once flourished, quiet sanctuaries where fragrant spices, fruit trees, and flowering shrubs grew in carefully tended plots. These gardens, often overlooked by travelers and historians alike, were vital to the daily life and well-being of the communities. Imagine stepping through a carved wooden gate into a shaded courtyard, where the scent of jasmine mingles with the sharp aroma of fresh herbs. Here, women and men tended to clove trees, pomegranate bushes, and sweet basil, cultivating a patchwork of greenery that contrasted sharply with the surrounding arid landscape. One such garden belonged to Hajara, a woman known for her knowledge of plants and their uses. She grew cardamom, cinnamon, and turmeric spices prized not only for flavor, but also for their medicinal properties. Her garden was both a source of nourishment and a place of healing. These gardens relied on ingenious irrigation systems, channels carved from coral and earth, catching rare rainfall and diverting seawater's moisture to sustain growth. Wells tapped into underground aquifers, while clay pots stored water carefully to prevent waste. The plants cultivated in these gardens played a crucial role in trade as well. Spices harvested here found their way onto dhows bound for markets as far as India and the Arabian Peninsula, weaving the coast into a global network of commerce. But beyond economics, these gardens were centers of cultural exchange. It reflected a blending of African, Arab, and Asian influences, a living mosaic of the diverse peoples who inhabited the coast. Hayara's garden was a place of quiet resilience, where life thrived against the odds, shaped by knowledge passed through generations and an intimate relationship with the land. And yet, such gardens were fragile, vulnerable to drought, urban expansion, and shifting social priorities. As you breathe in the mingled scents of these forgotten gardens, you might ask, how do these small pockets of life endure amid the tides of history and change? Hajara's garden was more than a simple patch of greenery. It was a carefully engineered ecosystem, thriving against the challenges posed by the coastal climate. The Swahili coast, with its salty air, scarce rainfall, and sandy soils, was hardly hospitable to lush vegetation, Yet these gardens flourished through ingenious adaptation and deep local knowledge. Water management was central. Rainfall was sporadic, so every drop was precious. Hajara and other gardeners employed a system of nguzos, small earth basins designed to catch and retain rainwater. Channels carved from coral rock funneled runoff to these basins, nourishing the roots of trees and herbs. They also harnessed the natural phenomenon of morning dew, collecting moisture from leaves and cool night air. Clay pots buried in soil-stored water, sealed to minimize evaporation. Wells tapped into shallow aquifers replenished by monsoon rains, though the rising salinity of groundwater presented a constant threat. The plants chosen for these gardens were both practical and symbolic. Spices like cloves and cinnamon, exotic, yet well-suited to the conditions, were highly valued in trade and daily life. Fruit trees such as mangoes and pomegranates provided essential nutrients and shade. Medicinal herbs grew alongside culinary plants, forming a living pharmacy for treating ailments from fevers to digestive troubles. The gardens were spaces of healing as well as sustenance. Tending these gardens required constant attention. The soil was nourished with compost, made from fish remains and plant waste, recycling nutrients in a sustainable loop. Weeding, pruning, and pest control were communal activities shared among families and neighbors. The gardens also served social functions. They were places for storytelling, for quiet reflection, and for passing down traditional knowledge. In the shade of a flowering tree, elders would teach children about plants, seasons, and the intertwined rhythms of land and sea. Yet pressures mounted. Urban growth encroached upon garden spaces, and changes in economic priorities shifted focus away from cultivation. Droughts and environmental degradation threatened the delicate balance that sustained these green oases. Despite these challenges, Hajara's garden remained a testament to human ingenuity and resilience, an enduring patch of life where culture, ecology, and history intertwined. As twilight descended and the scent of jasmine filled the air, you might wonder, what stories do these forgotten gardens tell about survival and connection in a changing world? As the decades passed, the forgotten gardens of the Swahili coast faced increasing threats from urban expansion, environmental change, and shifting social priorities. Yet, despite these pressures, pockets of these gardens persisted, safeguarded by families like Hajara's, who saw in them not just plants, but living memories. In the mid-20th century, as colonial cities grew and modern infrastructure expanded, many traditional gardens were replaced by concrete buildings and asphalt streets. The scents of clove and cinnamon, once common, faded into history for many urban dwellers. However, community elders and local historians began recognizing the importance of these green spaces not only as sources of food and medicine, but as repositories of cultural heritage. Efforts to document and preserve garden practices increased. Often blending modern horticulture with traditional knowledge, Hajara's garden, though smaller and more fragile, became a symbol of continuity. Young people were encouraged to learn the cultivation techniques. Understanding that these gardens were more than aesthetics, they were vital links to ancestral wisdom and ecological balance. Environmental challenges such as rising salinity, coastal erosion, and climate variability continue to test these gardens. Yet their resilience mirrors that of the communities that nurture them. Today, botanical researchers study the unique adaptations of plants grown in these gardens, seeking sustainable models for agriculture in arid and coastal zones worldwide. As you imagine the rustle of leaves in a forgotten courtyard and the faint fragrance of spices carried on the breeze, you might reflect, how does the quiet persistence of gardens shape the stories we tell about place, memory, and survival? Before the advent of modern streetlights and electric bulbs, the nights along the Swahili coast were cloaked in darkness, broken only by the gentle flicker of lanterns carried by those tasked with guiding travelers through narrow alleyways and bustling ports. These lantern bearers, humble yet essential figures, ensured safety and order in the shadows. Imagine walking through a winding lane in a coastal town, the soft glow of an oil lantern swaying gently in the hands of a young man named MZ Kamas. His lantern was fashioned from coconut shells and glass, filled with scented oil that cast a warm amber light. As he walked, the light illuminated the intricate carvings on coral stone walls and the wooden doors of modest homes. MZ Camis's job was more than holding a light. He knew every twist and turn, every uneven step, and every hidden obstacle. His presence reassured merchants returning late from the docks, families navigating the darkness, and visitors unfamiliar with the town's labyrinthine streets. Lantern bearers worked in shifts, their routes carefully planned to cover important thoroughfares, markets, mosques, and public squares. Their role extended beyond illumination. They acted as informal watchmen, alert to dangers like fires, thieves, or stray animals. The lantern's light was also symbolic. It marked thresholds between the known and unknown, between safety and peril. In a town dependent on maritime trade and seasonal rhythms, nightfall was a time when stories were told, secrets exchanged, and the community's pulse slowed but never ceased. Those seemingly ordinary lantern-bearers like MZ Camis played a crucial role in maintaining social cohesion and order after sunset. Their quiet vigilance allowed the town to function as a living, breathing organism, even in darkness. However, the introduction of electric lighting in the 20th century began to transform these nocturnal roles. Yet the image of the lantern-bearer remains a powerful symbol of guidance and care in the collective memory of the coast. As you picture the lantern's gentle glow piercing the night, you might wonder what stories are carried in the shadows and who holds the light when darkness falls. MZ Camis's footsteps echoed softly on the uneven coral stones as he made his rounds through the winding streets. The lantern he carried was more than a source of light. It was a lifeline in a town shaped by shadows and secrets. Navigating the labyrinthine alleys required not just familiarity with the paths, but an understanding of the town's rhythms, the ebb and flow of people, animals, and whispers. Each evening, as dusk melted into night, the lantern-bearers took their positions, their lanterns flickering like stars against the dark canvas. Their presence eased fears and deterred petty crime. But it also created a space where the community could gather, even after sunset. Markets that bustled during the day quieted, but nearby tea shops and homes came alive with conversation. The lanterns illuminated faces, revealing expressions of joy, worry, and routine that connected neighbors and shared experience. MZ Camis often found himself pausing to listen to stories, to offer directions, or to share news he had heard while on his route. His role extended beyond mere illumination. He was a living thread in the social fabric, yet the job demanded vigilance. Fires were a constant threat in the tightly packed wooden and coral houses. And the lanterns themselves were fragile. One careless movement could plunge a street into darkness and danger. As the 20th century approached, electric lights began to appear in parts of the coast. Their harsh, steady glow contrasted with the soft, dancing flames of the lanterns. While electricity promised greater safety and convenience, it also signaled the end of a tradition. MZ Camus watched these changes with quiet contemplation, aware that his role, once indispensable, was becoming a memory. Still, the lantern's glow remained a symbol of guidance, care, and the human desire to bring light into darkness. As you imagine the flickering lantern light tracing shadowy paths, you might ask, how do communities find their way when the old lights fade and new ones rise? The quiet transition from lantern light to electric bulbs marked more than a technological shift, represented a transformation in how communities navigated night and nurtured connection. Lantern bearers like MZ Camis, once vital guides through darkness, gradually faded from daily life, their footsteps replaced by the hum of electric currents. Yet in the stories passed down, their legacy endures. Elders recount tales of nights, lit by flickering flames, when a lantern's glow was both practical and deeply symbolic, a beacon of safety, hospitality, and communal care. Some towns preserved the lantern tradition during festivals, lighting paths with oil lamps to honor ancestors and history. These moments became opportunities to remember the slow human rhythms that once shaped coastal life. In modern times, as cities grow and darkness is conquered by artificial light, the image of the lantern bearer invites reflection. It It reminds us of a time when guidance required presence, patience, and a personal touch.
Yeah.
Missy Camus's lamp may have gone dark, but the idea of lighting the wave offering calm assurance in uncertain times remains a quiet, persistent thread in the fabric of Swahili culture. As you picture a single lantern's glow against the night, you might reflect, in a world increasingly illuminated by technology, what is lost when we forget the human hands that once carried the light along the sun-baked edges of the Swahili coasts? Vast salt flats shimmered under the relentless heat. These salt pans, natural formations shaped by tides and evaporation, were the site of a quiet but essential industry, salt harvesting. For centuries, salt, often called white gold, was more than a seasoning, was a currency, a preservative, and a vital trade commodity. Picture Juma, a salt harvester, rising before dawn to tend to the pans. His work was grueling and methodical, reliant on patience and an intimate knowledge of nature's cycles. Juma and his community would build shallow basins where seawater collected and slowly evaporated, leaving behind fine crystalline salt. The process was deeply seasonal. The dry months offered ideal conditions, but even then, weather could be unpredictable. Too much rain diluted the brine. Too much wind scattered the delicate crystals. Harvesters worked carefully, scraping the salt with wooden tools and stacking it into piles to dry. Salt harvesting shaped the rhythm of daily life. Families coordinated efforts, passing down techniques and observations through generations. The salt was then transported inland and across the coast, exchanged for goods ranging from cloth to spices. Yet this labor was often harsh and unrecognized. Harvesters faced blistering sun, salty skin, and the constant threat of storms. Their work sustained broader trade networks but remained physically demanding and precarious. Salt pans also held cultural significance. Harvest festivals marked the end of each season, blending gratitude with social celebration. Songs and dances honored the salt's role in sustaining life and connection. But the arrival of industrial salt production and colonial regulation began to alter traditional harvesting practices. Large-scale operations threatened the autonomy and livelihoods of local harvesters like Juma. As you imagine the vast white pans glistening under the sun and the steady scraping of salt, you might wonder, how do communities preserve ancient crafts? When the tides of commerce and technology rise, Juma's days were marked by the ceaseless interplay of sun, sea, and sand. The salt pans stretched like a patchwork quilt along the coast. Shallow basins edged with coral and sand, designed to trap seawater during high tide and release it slowly under the fierce heat. Harvesting salt was a delicate balance.
In the suns?
Intensity evaporated the water, leaving behind a thin crust of salt crystals. Too soon, and the salt would be impure. Too late, and the crystals would dissolve again with unexpected rain or tide. Juma and his fellow harvesters monitored weather patterns closely, reading clouds, wind shifts, and the monsoon's arrival with an almost ritualistic precision. Their knowledge was rooted in centuries of observation, passed down orally through stories and practices. The work was communal. Men, women, and children all had roles, from digging and maintaining basins to collecting and drying salt piles. The salt was heavy and coarse, packed into woven baskets for transport to nearby markets. This salt was more than an economic good. It was vital for food preservation, especially for coastal fishing communities reliant on salted fish for sustenance and trade. Culturally, salt symbolized purity and endurance. Salt harvest festivals involved prayers to sea spirits, songs that invoked the ancestors, and communal feasting. These events reinforced social bonds and honored the harsh work that sustained the community.
However,
the encroachment of colonial powers brought new challenges. Regulations often favored industrial extraction methods, restricting local access. Two prime salt flats. Harvesters like Juma found themselves squeezed between tradition and imposed modernization. Some adapted by working for colonial salt enterprises, while others resisted, striving to protect their ancestral rights and ways of life. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the white pans, you might ask yourself, in the struggle between tradition and change, how does a community find balance on shifting sands? The 20th century brought sweeping changes to the salt industry along the Swahili coast. Colonial governments and industrial enterprises sought to control salt production, introducing mechanized methods and centralized management. This shift threatened the traditional livelihoods of harvesters like Juma, whose intimate knowledge of the land and sea was sidelined. Yet resistance took many forms. Some communities organized to protect their access to ancestral salt flats, negotiating with authorities, or quietly continuing traditional harvesting despite restrictions. Others adapted, combining new techniques with old, preserving cultural practices while engaging with emerging markets. The social fabric woven through salt harvesting, family cooperation, ritual, and shared labor persisted even as the landscape changed. Salt festivals continued, carrying forward memories of the community's endurance and connection to the land. Today, local and international efforts aim to preserve traditional salt harvesting as part of cultural heritage. Scholars and activists highlight the ecological sustainability of these age-old practices compared to industrial methods. Juma's story, like that of many salt harvesters, is one of resilience. The crystals of salt he and his community gathered symbolize not only a vital resource, but also the persistent spirit of a people navigating the tides of history. As you envision the shimmering salt flats stretching beneath a vast sky, you might reflect. How do the smallest grains hold the greatest stories of survival and identity?